Before we get into today's video, which is going to be a very long video, I just want to preface it with what you're seeing on the screen right now, and that is they have internally, I guess, come to the conclusion that certain abilities in this Helminth ability list are OP, and they don't want them to be specifically chosen over all else. And I think that's smart, that's good. However, I don't necessarily agree with the way they're choosing to do it, but we'll see exactly how this plays out. But effectively, they're actually going to be nerfing the Helminth specific abilities when they're stolen. Not necessarily on the frame itself, but for instance, Roar has a diminished damage amount, Eclipse has diminished damage, and has a cap on damage reduction. Warcry for Valkyr has attack speed reduced, and I have my own thoughts about Valkyr. I don't necessarily think this one was warranted, but I mean, we'll talk about some of that later. Protea's Dispenser has duration reduced. We will see how much of a duration reduced this is. Like, a lot of these are pretty vague. We don't know. Nidus's Larva radius is reduced. Again, by how much? Like, is this going to completely destroy the skill? Is this, you know, not even gonna matter? It's really going to depend on how much these things get nerfed and how much they're going to force certain abilities into tiers, regardless of how powerful the initial skill is. Finally, Wukong's Defy has a capped amount of armor. I don't think that one's as big of a deal unless they really just blast the amount of armor. So if they reduce it to like 500, that's still probably going to be fine. Like, let's be honest, that's still going to be fine. It doesn't have to be 1500. It could be 500 and still be fine. But if they take it down to like 100, then we're talking about how much of a nerf are they trying to do, and what's the point of the system if we end up with a bunch of C tier skills. Now, I do have my own concerns with balance. But in the end, a skill is a skill, and taking the fun out of Warframe is not necessarily what you should do. Make the content harder and make everybody else A tier or S tier, you know, ability users. Don't necessarily hurt the kid that's doing well. You know what I mean? But anyway, back to the actual video. So, like the title of the video says, we're going to be covering my rank or tier B Helminth abilities. Before we get into specifically those, I do want to reiterate pretty quickly where and what my ranking tiers are. It won't take long. So my S tier is basically these things have the potential, or they outright do, change the meta. They're very, very powerful. S tier abilities are insane, and they will overpower whatever frame you put them on. They're just incredible at something or at everything. They're really, really good. A tier skills. These are very strong abilities that are almost always going to be better than something that is currently on your frame, even if it's a decent ability. A tier abilities are just in general pretty powerful, and the fact that you get to pick what you put on your frame makes that synergy that you might be able to get out of, say, Hildren's Pillage and being a shield frame, etc., etc. It makes them extremely strong. B tier abilities can be very strong. So my B tier isn't necessarily these are bad. Most of these either have a niche that they're really good at, but they're not like incredible or game changing in any way. Some of them are really solid abilities. Some of them have some great flavor, but in general, B is just going to be a little less powerful than A, or potentially less flexible than A. So we have C tier. C tier, these are pretty bad. It doesn't mean you can't take them, but it's more often than they're more often going to be a loss for your character than a gain for your character, just because most frames have better abilities than the ones you get from the C rank Helminth abilities. And then finally, D rank. D rank abilities are really, really bad. I wouldn't recommend taking them. They're not necessarily horrific. However, I do want to make a little disclaimer here that whenever you look at these abilities, you're no longer just looking at, hey, this ability does X, Y, and Z. It is, what could I have gotten? And that's going to be generally why some of these B picks are B picks instead of A picks. And they're going to be why some C picks are C instead of B, etc., etc. So some of these abilities are just simply outclassed by something in a higher tier or even within the same tier. So let's go ahead and get into my picks. And just like in my last video, I'm going to be going in the order that I have my tier list in, not necessarily what the community has. And the community, if we just jump over here and look at the votes, and this is good that everybody's voting, because there are quite a few votes by this point over at overframe.gg. But even if you look at some of these abilities, like Eclipse, right? Some people believe this is a D rank ability. I don't understand this. This is either trolling or people just don't know how powerful it can be. Now, I mean, dispensary, the same thing. Like, a lot of these don't make sense as to why someone would even possibly consider some of these really, really great abilities to be D tier. However, beyond some of the trolling or maybe just misinformation that people might have, the tier list is actually pretty good, and I agree with it most of the time, but that's why I'm making this video, because I do disagree with a few of these picks, and I can generally explain why, and that's what I'm going to try to do. So the very first pick that I have on my B tier list is Equinox's Rest and Rage. And as well, it has the Augment Common Frenzy. So this thing is either, depending on your energy color, going to be a CC or a damage increase. Now the damage increase is a multiplicative damage increase. So you basically point at a target, and that target and everybody near him takes more damage. Now this is a multiplicative increase, which is incredibly powerful. And the CC isn't bad either. Now, one of the bad things about this skill is, because you're not actually Equinox and the way they're implementing the skill, you're not going to be able to switch between these. These are based on your energy color before you enter a mission. So you're going to have to pick. Now, in general, I think Rage is a very powerful skill, and in general would be an A tier skill, possibly even higher. Possibly an S tier, except for one limiting factor. And then also the rest portion of it is a very powerful ability, probably low A tier in my opinion, but probably maybe even high B tier. The thing that really holds this back is the fact that you absolutely pretty much have to take the augment for it to proliferate. So basically what this augment does is targets that have this effect on them, whether it be Rest or Rage, will proliferate it when they die. So it'll jump onto more enemies in that vicinity, right? So it kind of works like Sarins' ability or Volt's ability, where it jumps. Without that jump feature, this is a point and click small AoE thing, and you're going to find yourself casting it a lot. Now that being said, it is cheap to cast, but if you don't take the augment, it's going to be not that great of an ability. It's not terrible, just not that great. That being said, I could definitely see people putting this in A tier. It is a really great ability. I just don't like the fact that it requires an augment, and a lot of the B tier picks that we're going to go over require augments to make them function at a B tier level, which is why they're here. So moving on now, we have Valkyr. Now, I know the community's placed Valkyr very high in the A tier. I don't agree with this at all, so we're going to also talk about this one for a second. So Valkyr gets Warcry. Warcry basically is an AoE steroid for yourself and your teammates that increases attack speed while slowing down nearby enemies. It also gives you an armor bonus. Now the thing that I don't super like about this is the fact that it's not multiplicative. That's basically what it comes down to. The attack speed is additive with your other attack speeds. The armor bonus is additive with your other armor bonuses. The slow is sort of unique. There's other ways to proc it, but for the most part, it's a unique buff. But it is additive. And secondarily, the other thing that I don't like about Warcry is the fact that it's a giant steroid. The main reason why you take this is for the DPS increase, that attack speed. Melee is already really, really strong. Like, it's the DPS on some of these weapons, most of these weapons at this point, actually, since they reworked it, is bonkers. Like, it's so high that I think Warcry is actually, it ends up being kind of overkill most of the time, and attack speed also makes it really hard to keep up with. So unless you're using a macro, you're going to develop carpal tunnel if you run this and another attack speed mod or something. So in general, I think this kind of overplayed its hand as a buff. Now that being said, you can take off your other attack speed bonuses and put something else on. That does work, and that is fine. Just keep in mind, generally, when you mod weapons, and this is going to come down to a lot of different things we're going to talk about, for instance, shock for Volt. In general, when you mod a weapon, you kind of want to diversify your stats to increase its DPS. If you just take a bunch of flat damage, you're going to start running into diminishing returns, so multi-shot is better. Once you take some multi-shot, maybe crit's better, maybe status is better, maybe this, or maybe fire rate's better, etc, etc, etc. So generally diversifying your stats is better, and on melee weapons, you don't want to just stack up a bunch of one stat, especially if you're doing combo stuff. So if you're doing combo multiplier based slots or status based slots, like conditioned overload, you're going to run into diminishing returns pretty quickly on other mods. So you generally are going to want attack speed on the weapon itself. Now the armor bonus is pretty nice, it's okay, but it's not good for shield frames, for instance, so it doesn't really matter for them, but it does matter for health frames. And then the slowdown is very whatever. It's an okay debuff, but it's not going to stop damage coming in, really, and it doesn't also affect enemies that are outside of the Warcry when you first cast it. So if you want to do a really long duration build with Warcry, you're not going to have a lot of range, so it isn't something that follows you around. That being said, the augment is pretty nice. So Eternal War basically allows you to take your Warcry, and whenever you get a kill, it extends its duration a little bit. From what I understand, this can only extend up to twice the normal duration. That does scale with ability duration though, so if you have a normal duration of 30 seconds, it goes up to 60. It's really nice, so you don't have to cast it all the time, because this is a very expensive ability. So that's going to cover it for Valkyr. I wanted to go a little bit more in depth with Valkyr, just because I am moving her down an entire tier from what the community expects. So that's my thoughts on it. If you disagree, feel free to let me know why in the comment section below. But moving on, my next up is going to be Banshee. So Banshee's ability is really, really interesting to me. Let me try to find her on the actual screen. Where is she? Oh, there she is, sorry. So Banshee gets silence. So basically, it's a giant AoE CC. It stuns enemies, and they are also quote-unquote silenced. It's really cool. Now, one of the restrictions of silence is that if you are inside the bubble, the stun can't proc on an enemy again. You actually have to leave and then come back for that bubble around you to hit an enemy. This thing has a very acceptable duration. It lasts a long time. And if you reduce your range, you're actually going to be able to create a small bubble around you. Now, this bleeds into the augment that it uses, and it's the reason why it's ranked, into the B tier, is that it really requires an augment for this play style. But in my opinion, the way silence will probably be played is you effectively limit your range really, really small, and then you put on the augment, and that opens up enemies to finishers, and your finishers deal 300% more damage. This is an absolutely enormous damage increase, and this ability is going to be really cool to run around with certain frames as executioners. I'm thinking stealth frames and stuff like that, where maybe enemies are alerted, but you still get to do executions and stuff like that in maps where it's not necessarily spies and you're not playing solo. So I think an executioner build could be really, really cool as Banshee, with Banshee silence on other frames that are, a little bit more powerful than Banshee, or even frames that, could be buffed by this sort of CC. Overall, I think it's a really, really great skill, limited to the fact that you have to have the augment to really make its play style quote unquote viable. Next up we have Excalibur's Radial Blind. This is very similar to Banshee's Silence. You do an AoE CC. It is not a persistent effect around you, however, so it doesn't work exactly like Silence does. But what you're going to be able to do is you're going to be able to pop a big AoE CC. It lasts for a very long time, and it has an identical augment to Banshee's Silence. So basically, when you blind them, it's going to open them up to finishers, and you're going to get a bunch of extra finisher damage when you do this. So all in all, Excalibur's... Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't actually move to Excalibur's Radial Blind. I'm sorry about that. All in all, Excalibur's Radial Blind is very powerful as an instant CC. It's defensive. It can be offensive in an Executioner build. I think in an Executioner build, it's not quite as good as Banshee's Silence, but it is a better oh crap button. So all in all, I think it's a very, very solid skill. Next up on the list, we actually have the first of its type, Oberons Smite. So again, this is one of those abilities that really leans on its augment, Smite Infusion. So basically, Smite is a really cool ability where you cast on a target and then a bunch of things come out and hit an enemy over and over. It does very little damage. It's not super great for as a DPS skill. However, if you take the augment, you're going to be able to hold down this ability and send out an AoE buff to your team that gives you 100% bonus radiation damage. Now this radiation damage does stack additively with other elemental mods you have on your weapons. However, it does also stack with strength. So if you have a 100% strength build, this does do 100%, but if you stacked it up to 200 or 250%, which is fairly easy to do, you're going to be talking about, you know, 200, 250% extra radiation damage on a weapon. This thing is going to be absolutely killer to place on Volts for Eidolon hunting. I think it's going to be really, really good in Eidolon hunting, and parties are going to start taking this as their Helminth, or one of the people is going to take it as their Helminth ability. This is going to be really, really great for that, but I think it's really good in general. It scales very well with strength, and it is a large but additive bonus. Is that to say that Roar or things like that aren't more powerful? No, it's not. Roar is more powerful because it's a multiplier. However, when you have a party that already has, you know, all of these other buffs like Roar, or possibly in certain scenarios Eclipse, not in Eidolon hunting, but you know, in other scenarios, or you already have Harrow and you already have the crit bonus and all that, these are things that are getting added on and increasing the party's power in certain situations. So Eidolon hunting is going to be more powerful than it used to be. It's going to be easier and faster than it used to be. So just keep in mind, some of these combos are going to start coming to light, and it's going to be really, really cool to see what people can do with them. So that's Oberon. Next up we have Volt. Now I rated Volt a little bit lower just because of a very specific interaction with Eidolon farming. This thing is almost identical to Oberons Smite scenario. So the shock itself doesn't do a lot of damage. It doesn't have your passive to kind of work off of because you're not Volt, so you don't get the passive. However, the augment allows you to do electricity damage to the tune of 100% bonus. Again, the exact same way. It scales additively with your other elemental bonuses, and you can put it on other people. It is an AoE buff. The only reason I have him a little bit lower is because it's actually better to steal Smite and to put it on Volt than it is to steal Volts and to put it on Smite, at least in the scenario for Eidolon farming. Other than that, these are very, very equivalent skills. Radiation damage is great against Alloy. Shock is just better than it used to be, or I should say electricity damage is just kind of better than it used to be, and it's good against Infested and even Corpus and things like that. So they're both really, really great. I like them a lot. Next up, I actually have Harrow. Now, Harrow is still kind of lingering on the bottom of A tier, and I don't know if I'm, you know, certain that it doesn't belong there necessarily, because it's a little bit weird. So Harrow's Condemn is a great CC. just in how exactly it works. Basically, you send out a conal front wave of CC. It freezes enemies exactly in place. That's why it's so good, because it's very easy to get headshots with it. It's really good. It also restores shields and overshields, so that's definitely a bonus. However, I don't know how the augment is going to work. So this augment, called Tribunal, basically gives you some of Harrow's other functionality as well. Now, in general, these can't exist if you don't already have the abilities and you're already activating them. So I don't think the augment is going to do anything when you steal Harrow's ability. I could be wrong about that. If I am, this definitely deserves to be bumped up. But if it isn't, I think it belongs pretty squarely down in the B bracket. Strong CC, good defensive recovery skill. It can actually affect some mini bosses as well, from what I understand. I don't play Harrow a lot. I do have him, and he's cool and fun, and he has really good crit bonuses. But yeah, so good skill, good strong CC, interesting. Not the best thing in the world. Not quite the AoE that we get out of Excalibur and stuff like that. Pretty cool potential with headshotting though. So moving on, we have Barduch's Lull. So Barduch, I think, is a little bit lower in the tier list according to the community. I think he's a little bit above to me. This is an AoE CC very similar to the blind we see from Excalibur. So basically enemies will slow down to the point of falling asleep. Now this does take a little bit of time. It isn't instantaneous. It happens over about, I think, 2 or 3 seconds. It's been a minute since I played Barduch because we're not going to talk about that. But anyway, Barduch's Lull is actually a really great AoE CC, and it functions kind of interestingly. Now this is a niche case. It's not always going to be valuable, but enemies reset their alert status, so they'll forget that they were in combat. They'll forget that you're there. This can be used in a number of ways. It doesn't have an augment that increases finisher damage like Excalibur does. However, it is a very good size AoE and a very strong CC that lasts a long time as well. So in general, this is just a good CC ability. I think it could be great on some people. Is it better than Excalibur's Blinding Flash ever? Right now, I don't think so. Except in that niche resets alert status. But other than that, I think it's a really solid ability. Next up, we have Sarins Molt. So, Sarins Molt. This is a really good oh crap button. That's what it is. Basically, when you hit it, you will spawn a... Let me find her real quick. You spawn a decoy. This decoy is invincible, and it gains health based on the damage that it takes during this period. So effectively what it is it actually has the ability to scale. That's really important. So when it takes all this damage from higher level enemies, it will become itself more tanky. This is really, really good. It cures statuses when you use it, and it also has a lot of threat. So enemies will be more likely to attack it instead of you. You can also spawn it in the air, and it makes it basically pseudo invincible from melee attackers, so it'll be able to last longer, even though they'll still be drawn to it. However, its augment isn't super great. It'll basically give you a heal over time. The heal isn't that powerful, especially when we're talking about having, 1,000 plus health. It's just not going to be that great. But overall, the ability is a very solid oh crap button. I could see people using this, especially considering it's so thematic. It's really, really cool. Maybe even replace other decoy abilities with it, just so that they're better. But anyway, next up we have Grendels Nourish ability. This is very interesting. So a friend of mine and I did some testing, and I'm not 100% sure if all of this is bugged or not. However, if we look at certain abilities that give weapons increased damage, this would include the Smite infusion from Oberon or Volt's Shock Trooper. These abilities don't actually end up affecting other abilities, even if they're considered weapons. We did some mild testing with basically Excalibur and with Vabin, because his flechette orbs are considered, a weapon. and they don't actually affect it. However, Grendels Nourish does. So that is a kind of check mark in Grendel's sheet there. It can actually buff certain abilities. Now that being said, is it ever going to be better than Roar? More than likely not. But in some niche cases where you want to do toxin damage instead of your other type, whereas Roar would just buff your base ability up more, Grendels Nourish adds a 50% bonus to toxin, or as toxin damage. So if toxin would actually benefit your diversity of using your skill a little bit more, it could actually be better than Roar in some niche cases. One example of this is Vabin's Flechette Orbs. So Flechette Orbs generally do puncture damage. So if I throw them out and then I roar, they're going to do more puncture damage, which means they're going to be better at dealing with armor. However, if I were to instead pop Nourish, I would be able to deal more toxin damage and deal a lot more damage to Corpus. So that is an interesting kind of caveat. It makes my Flechette Orbs better at dealing with the other factions a little bit and not necessarily just buffing what it's already good at. So I think this thing is going to have a place for certain weapon type abilities, but it does kind of sit down in the B tier because, you know, it's not universally powerful. It is very much going to be a niche pick. Next up on my list, we have Embers Fire Blast. So Embers Fire Blast is actually a really solid skill. I think it belongs right around here in the tier list. Basically, you slam the ground. It's a decent CC. It's very large. You'll get armor strip from it. However, because you don't have heat, because you're not Ember when you steal this skill, it isn't going to scale up that armor strip. So the base, I believe, is 50%, and it scales up all the way up to 100% armor steal. But because you can't scale it with your heat, you're never actually going to be able to get it up to anything past 50%. However, it does also have a guaranteed heat proc. So not only is it going to strip a bunch of armor, it's going to proc heat, which is going to strip more armor. So this thing is really great at armor stripping. It's really good at armor stripping. In general, it's going to be a good skill. Is it better than some of the other skills that, you know, like Hildren's Pillage, for instance? I don't think so. I don't think it's going to be as good. It's not quite as versatile. It is a very solid skill in certain scenarios where you're dealing with a heavy amount of Grenier pretty much exclusively, though. Also, its Augment Healing Flame, it isn't that great. It heals you based on which enemies you hit with Fire Blast. It's okay. It's okay, especially when we're dealing with, again, higher levels of health pools. It isn't going to tick as much on you. So it's okay, though. Korra's Ensnare. So let's go ahead and take a look at Korra's Ensnare. Where is this thing? It's up here where people believe it's in the A tier. I don't agree with this. However, I understand why people put it in the A tier. So what Ensnare does is it's a good CC. You basically target an enemy, you pop Ensnare on them, and enemies are drawn to them. So enemies are drawn to them from around corners, pretty much wherever they are, very similar to Vortex, and they get pulled across the ground until they get there and they group up on that enemy. That being said, you don't have Korra's ability synergy, so you can't spread Ensnare to another target when you've already cast it on an enemy. So you're going to have to recast this ability over and over. It's not the most expensive, but it's not a super cheap skill either. And then we also have to compare it to Larva, and that's where it kind of, to me, gets shoved down even further just because it's compared to something that's already in the list. We already have an AoE pull. Larva costs less energy to use, pulls way faster. Enemies don't kind of slide across the ground. They get yanked out of, they're just, you're not there anymore. You're in this weird mass of mutagen-ness. And it has a bigger range. It just has a bigger range. Now, the duration isn't as much for Larva, but you can just cast it again and pull a bunch of enemies again. So I think because it's in the list with a better skill, like an outright better skill, this thing belongs in B tier. I get why people put in A tier, but because it can't proliferate and chain itself all the time, and because it basically is just inferior to larva in every other way other than duration, it's going to be really bad. I shouldn't say really bad. It's going to be bad in comparison to larva. As well, it doesn't currently have an augment, so maybe one day it'll be, you know, back in A tier or S tier for me. But personally, with the ability to take larva, I can't see a reason why you would take in Snare. Disclaimer, I don't think Core should replace her in Snare with larva, even though larva is a better version of it. I think there's a lot of better stuff that she can take, like Dispensary, to deal with some of her issues. Her build is a little tight for farming, so Dispensary would really help her be able to maintain all of her abilities and combos and stuff like that. So I think Dispensary is a better replacement than just replacing Ensnare with, you know, larva or something. So anyway, moving on, next up I have Atlas. So this might actually surprise some people that I'm placing it, you know, right behind Cores and Snare. But let's go ahead and find Atlas down here somewhere. Atlas Petrify. So Petrify, what is Petrify? This thing is basically an absolute CC. It happens instantaneously. The only real bad thing about this is that it is a cone. This thing is a cone in front of you. You cannot increase the angle of the cone at all. You can increase the range. So the best way to use this skill is theoretically to be really high up in the air and shoot a cone downwards and hit a bunch of things. It's not practical. So you're never going to really do that. However, it is a multiplicative damage increase. It will lower resistances, not armor, but resistances. So what this means is, if you guys are familiar with how corrosive damage or viral damage or the types of damage work, different types of health, shields, or armor may be resistant to certain types of damages. This thing will lower that resistance. So this thing is really good if you're dealing, for instance, like fire damage to shields or something, where, or not shields, like to armor, where it's resistant to it. Or dealing fire damage to shields and things like that. Now, where it's not going to help you is it's not really going to help you if you're dealing magnetic to shields or if you're dealing corrosive to armor. It lowers that resistance, and that resistance was already really low, so it lowers it even less. So to give you an idea, I think the wiki states that if you're doing a weakness against something that's already weak to something, it's like a 13% increase in damage. Whereas if they are not weak to something, if they're strong against it, it's like a 50% bonus, and it is multiplicative. So it's a decent DPS increase, though it's not super consistent based on what you're using. So you're going to have to be very smart with what damage types you're using if you want to get a lot of value out of that. However, even though it's not a great CC, even though it doesn't have a great cone, a great AoE, it does have the ability to take a loot augment. This is really great. Taking loot augments is going to affect farming. I think there are some niche case builds where you're going to be able to use Atlas's Petrify in a farming setup effectively, and where it's the best skill that you can actually use. So that alone puts it in the B tier for me. Generally, you're going to be grouping up enemies into a larva ball, so the cone is going to work just as fine as having a 20-meter AoE blast radius, you know, hitting everything in the room. It doesn't matter. You're going to be larvaing things together, and then you're going to be petrifying them, and then you're going to be slash procking them, and then you're going to be decrepifying them, and you're all going to be in a pilfering dome or a pilfering swarm from, you know, Hydroid or something, and it's going to feel really cool to set some of these new loot teams up. So it's a really cool skill, and I think it has its place. It's just a very niche case. Moving on, we have Titania's Spellbind. Let's find Titania. So this thing is kind of okay. It's an interesting effect. Let's try to find it here. Titania's Spellbind, there we go. So effectively, you target an enemy, and in an AoE around it, this is very similar to Rest and Rage. A bunch of enemies will be whisked into the air, and they're basically not going to be able to do anything. This is a cheap skill to use. It is a complete CC. It can kind of ragdoll enemies in weird ways. So it's okay. It doesn't really have a lot of great effect compared to some of the other stuff we've seen. However, its augment is very interesting. So if you hit 4 or more people with this ability, you will actually regenerate energy. So this thing costs 25 energy to use, and you get 50 energy back if it hits 4 or more enemies. Now that being said, that 50 energy does scale with strength. So if you have plus 100% strength, you're going to be getting 100 energy back from this ability when you've only used 25 to cast it. This can be your own personal energy battery if you have problems with that. I could definitely see some characters that already have the ability to group, such as maybe Chorus and Snare, where Dispensary might be a little slow and immobile. This would be more mobile. This would allow you to move around a bit and to be able to be more dynamic. I think Dispensary is still way stronger. However, with the augment, this thing can be a decent energy battery. So we're going to go ahead and move on from that, and we're going to talk about Ash. Now, Ash is one of those abilities where basically you have these shurikens and you throw them and they bleed. Ash is already good at bleeding, so if you're stealing these, you're going to be slightly less good with them. The base ability isn't great. It really isn't, unless you have certain other abilities that scale off of these, such as Rhino's Roar. That would be faction damage, so it scales multiplicatively with your bleed effect from shurikens. So that would work really well. But in general, that's really niche. It's not going to work great. But the augment, again, you'll notice a lot of these B tier abilities, the augment saves them. If you have 42 or 43% ability strength, the augment will actually allow you to 100% strip armor. Now, we have other armor strips in the tier list already, and they're better than, a single target or 2 targets. They hit an actual AoE. However, this is the only one where we can very reliably and very easy in our setup hit 100% armor removal. This has some niche cases where it is incredibly powerful. So just keep an eye out for those situations. It can very much be a good skill to steal and learn if you're dealing with things that have a lot of armor or certain other situations. I'll let you guys explore that. Next up, we have Vabin. And if you guys have been on my channel for any amount of time, I'm not going to go super far into this, but I love Vabin. He's basically my favorite frame. I wish they would let me redo his abilities, because I would make them insanely overpowered, and he would be, anyway, let's not talk about it. But yeah, you get Tesla Nervos. I have an entire video on this. It's a somewhat complicated skill. It's not great on its own, but again, B tier, the tier of augments. The augment saves this thing. The augment is incredibly good if you're not up against armor. So I'm not even actually going to go into what the base skill does, but what the augment does is it records all damage dealt to a target and releases that in an AoE of electricity whenever that enemy dies. So if you're fighting an enemy and there's 2 enemies right next to each other and they both have the same health pool, you attach a Tesla Nervos to one of them, you kill that person, and then the guy next to him takes all of the damage that the other one just took, and he also dies. This thing has a very respectable area of effect, and it is incredibly powerful against Infested and Corpus. Against armor, it does very little damage. It doesn't have the ability to penetrate armor, unless you're doing like a multi-person really buffed up corrosive aura build where everybody is running corrosive armor reduction on their aura slots. You're not going to be able to really get a lot of value out of it on Grenier maps, or even corrupted maps for that matter. So all in all, it's a really great augment, but it does require the augment, and it does have a severe weakness against armor. If you want more information about that though, check out my video on it. Moving on to Mesa. Neza has the Firewalker ability. Let me try to find him. I always want to say it's a her, but it's a him. So Neza, Firewalker. Basically, you get a very decent sprint bonus. You get some sprint speed, and you also have fire on the ground following you. This is pretty decent if you're running to escape something. Not that enemies can ever keep up with you, really, ever. But, you know, if you want to pretend like you're in a getaway scene and you poured some oil and the enemy slips, and well, yeah, that works. But all in all, the fire is just a nice little bonus. It does proc its heat status effect, so it is going to be lowering armor for enemies nearby. This can have some interesting combinations with other really fast frames, so I could definitely see like a Blaze Walker, like some sort of Blaze Walker Gauss, where he just like jets across the screen and sets the entire screen on fire really fast. This has some interesting synergies with him specifically, but all in all, it's not a super great skill. It is if you want to go really fast, but that is a niche case where you're doing like solo spy missions or something. The augment doesn't help it too much. Basically, you collect all of the damage you deal while it's active, and you deal that in an explosion of fire damage. Not the worst damage type. It will be pretty decent on infested maps. I don't see it doing well in Corpus or Grenier though. So all in all, decent skill, cool, niche, flavorful, not super powerful. Next up, we have Mesa's Shooting Gallery. Now we're starting to get kind of towards the low end of B. This is where I kind of put Mesa's ability. I don't know why it's as high in B as it is. Maybe just because Mesa's strong. But basically, you give yourself and a nearby ally a boost, a very small damage bonus, and the damage bonus does scale with ability strength, but it is additive with other damage bonuses like Hornet Strike, or like your serration on your rifles. So this thing isn't a great bonus. I think it's 25% at its base level, and it doesn't even go on the full team. It basically revolves around one other person on your team. It will disarm enemies on occasion. This is a decent but unreliable CC, and its augment can occasionally also blind people when your shooting gallery friend kills a bunch of people. It's not great. It's a damage buff. It's a slight CC. I view it as a very low B tier pick. Very low B tier. Next up, we have Octavia's Resonator. Thank goodness this isn't an A tier. This thing doesn't have any of the synergies that Octavia has. You don't have all of her other abilities to combo off of. I don't even know why it's this high in B. Effectively, you send out a little ball, it rolls around and CCs people. It is a very nice set it and forget it skill. It will hunt and seek enemies. The augment allows you to kind of point it around. I don't foresee you ever taking the augment if you take it when you're not Octavia and you're not using it already to combo with actual damage dealing abilities and things like that. So unfortunately, it's one of those things where it's really great on the frame that originated the progenitor frame of the ability, but on other people it's not going to be super great. It's an unreliable but somewhat easy to use skill that CCs enemies. And then finally we have in the B tier Revenant's Reeve ability. Now this one I agree with where it's placed. It is at the outright bottom tier ability for B tier. It is the bottom tier ability. Effectively, what this thing does is it is a mildly acceptable oh crap button. You effectively dash a short range. You cleanse statuses by actually putting them on enemies you dash through. You will recover basically your life pool, your shields or health when you dash through enemies based on how many enemies you hit with it. Additionally, the augment allows you to blind them. The blind is okay. The blind hits enemies for a decent duration. I think it's 10 seconds. I don't have, all the graphics overlays that you guys are seeing right now, so I'm doing all of this pretty much from memory. But yeah, I think Blinding Reeve is about 10 seconds that enemies get hit or blinded for. It does scale with ability duration, if I recall correctly, and it's okay. As an oh crap button, it's okay. The only problem with that is we have way better oh crap buttons already, even within the B tier. Even within the B tier. So that is going to do it for my B tier list, guys. If I missed anything or misrepresented anything, if you guys don't agree with me and you think some of these abilities should be higher or lower, let me know in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.